The early morning mist clung to the swollen banks of the Rhine, curling over jagged rocks and the remnants of shattered bridges. The river's surface glinted under the first hesitant rays of sunlight, a mirror for the skeletal remains of steel and wood that had once carried troops and tanks across. Somewhere upstream, a muffled rumble stirred the fog, hesitant at first, then gaining momentum. From the German lines on the far shore, binoculars traced the movement of strange, ungainly vehicles, half truck, half boat, crawling through the shallow waters like mechanical amphibians. Laughter broke the tense silence, carried on the cold wind. "Toys," muttered an officer, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing more than parade floats." But as the minutes passed, the vehicles pressed forward, undeterred by currents, jagged debris, or the collapsed bridge pylons that would have halted any conventional convoy. Behind them, infantry clutched their rifles, eyes widening, as crates of ammunition, fuel, and rations trundled safely into positions that had seemed unreachable just hours before. Explosions echoed in the distance, artillery responding too late. And the river, once a barrier, became a conduit. The Allied advance was not slowed. It flowed, unstoppable, reshaping the battlefield in ways the Wehrmacht had not anticipated. And in that cold dawn, the first whispers of disbelief began to spread through the German ranks. The DUK trucks were no toy. They were the vanguard of a new way to wage war. By late 1944, the Western Front had become a maelstrom of destruction and improvisation. After the Normandy landings in June, Allied forces pushed relentlessly across France, shattering the German defensive lines and forcing retreats that revealed both the resilience and the logistical vulnerabilities of modern mechanized warfare. Towns lay in ruins, roads cratered from artillery, and bridges had been systematically destroyed, either by retreating German engineers or by relentless Allied bombardment. Supplies, the lifeblood of any advancing army, could no longer rely on conventional routes. Trucks and tanks choked on debris-littered roads, often halted by a single collapsed bridge or swollen river. The Wehrmacht, battered and overstretched, monitored each Allied advance with a mix of disbelief and frustration. Intelligence reports highlighted the growing strain. Ammunition depots were distant from the front, fuel convoys had become frequent targets, and every river crossing had become a potential bottleneck. Commanders on both sides realized that mobility, more than firepower, would dictate the outcome of the next operations. Amid this strategic chaos, the U.S. Army began deploying a relatively unremarkable vehicle that would quietly redefine logistics: the DUKW. Developed in 1942 as a six-wheel drive amphibious truck, it was initially dismissed by many frontline officers as an awkward curiosity, unsuitable for the rigors of combat. Yet, in the fractured landscapes of northern France and the Low Countries, its ability to traverse both roads and rivers without requiring bridges offered a vital solution. Crews were trained rapidly, learning to navigate currents, avoid submerged debris, and maintain the delicate balance between speed and cargo stability. Military planners incorporated the DUKW into supply chains that would have been impossible for conventional trucks, delivering fuel to armored columns stranded behind destroyed crossings, ferrying ammunition to isolated infantry positions, and evacuating the wounded from terrain that would otherwise be impassable. German reconnaissance reports grew increasingly concerned, noting these floating trucks, moving in coordination with artillery and infantry, arriving precisely where supplies were needed most. Slowly, the perception of the DUKW shifted from novelty to necessity, a mechanized lifeline threading through the chaos of war. By the autumn of 1944, Intelligence networks on both sides had begun cataloging every innovation and improvised tactic emerging from the shattered European landscape. Reconnaissance planes captured images of convoys threading rivers, while intercepted radio traffic hinted at supply deliveries reaching frontline units at unprecedented speeds. The German High Command struggled to understand the scale and implications of these logistical maneuvers. In reports filed from units along the Meuse and Rhine, officers expressed a mix of astonishment and unease. Supply depots that should have been cut off were fully stocked. Artillery crews never waited long for ammunition, and armored units pressed forward despite destroyed bridges that had been intended as natural choke points. The technological advantage, subtle but decisive, lay not in firepower but in movement. The DUKW, with its watertight hull, six-wheel drive traction, and ability to maintain stability in strong currents, allowed Allied forces to exploit gaps in German defensive planning. It rendered rivers and destroyed infrastructure temporary inconveniences rather than insurmountable barriers. Behind this mechanical efficiency was meticulous planning and adaptation. Drivers, engineers, and quartermasters studied river depths, current velocities, and potential obstacles. Amphibious maneuvers were coordinated with artillery schedules and infantry advances to maximize tactical effect. A single DUKW convoy could deliver hundreds of rounds of ammunition to an isolated infantry company, reposition a section of anti-tank guns, and evacuate casualties in a single cycle. The German troops, initially amused by these floating trucks, began encountering them in unexpected places. Upstream crossings they assumed impassable, flooded meadows, and river bends that had been used as defensive anchors. Field reports cataloged the growing frustration of officers who saw well-stocked positions appear overnight where they expected starvation and disarray. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was measurable. Morale in units cut off from traditional supply lines declined as rumors spread that the Allies had found a way to render rivers, and the defensive plans built around them, irrelevant. The DUKW, simple in concept, but devastating in execution, exemplified a fundamental shift in the logistics of modern warfare, one that blurred the line between front and rear, between impassable terrain and open highway. Soldiers at the front first noticed the DUKWs not as weapons, but as a strange, persistent hum on the water. Infantrymen trudging through mud and shell-scarred roads would glance up and see the six-wheeled silhouettes cutting across river currents, carrying everything from ammunition to rations, seemingly immune to the obstacles that slowed conventional convoys. One report from the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division described a column of DUKWs delivering fuel to forward tanks in the midst of a partially destroyed bridge. They came like metal swans on the water. And the tanks didn't wait. The human element was immediate. Soldiers' letters and diaries chronicled relief and astonishment. They could fight longer, move faster, and maintain positions that would otherwise have been untenable. Medical units used the trucks to evacuate wounded under fire, transforming rivers from deadly hazards into evacuation routes. The DUKW crews themselves faced constant danger: artillery fire, submerged debris, and unpredictable currents. Yet their coordinated maneuvers and precise timing reflected rigorous training and an understanding of both machinery and human need. From a tactical perspective, the DUKWs disrupted German defensive calculations. River crossings, traditionally predictable points of confrontation, became fluid and deceptive. The Wehrmacht's standard strategies, fortified riverbanks, demolition of bridges, and reliance on natural choke points, lost effectiveness. Allied commanders could stage multiple supply insertions across the same stretch of river, often simultaneously, creating redundancy and resilience that German officers could not anticipate. The DUKW's versatility allowed artillery positions to be resupplied during ongoing engagements, extending bombardment duration without halting momentum. In several documented instances, the ability to maintain uninterrupted supply directly influenced the outcome of localized engagements, enabling infantry to hold positions or armor units to exploit gaps before German reinforcements arrived. Intelligence reports cataloged these effects meticulously, noting that the truck's presence had shifted not only tactical options, but also morale on both sides. Technologically, the DUKW represented a synthesis of design and practical necessity. Its watertight hull, powered six-wheel drive, and rear-mounted propeller allowed it to transition seamlessly from road to river. Engineers refined suspension and hull reinforcements to survive debris-laden currents, while fuel and cargo compartments were adapted for rapid loading and unloading. Maintenance crews operated under pressure, often performing repairs in forward areas, highlighting a symbiosis between mechanical reliability and operational effectiveness. German observers initially dismissed these innovations as inconsequential, but after repeated encounters, their reconnaissance reports began noting the DUKW's speed, resilience, and adaptability, qualities that would influence future German defensive planning. Commanders on both sides quickly realized the implications. Allied leaders coordinated DUKW deployments with infantry assaults and armored maneuvers, ensuring that logistical advantage translated directly into combat power. German officers, confronted with what they initially called toy trucks, were forced to reconsider defensive dispositions, redeploy forces to guard unexpected crossings, and adapt counter-artillery plans to account for uninterrupted supply. The DUKWs, unarmed but strategically potent, blurred the line between logistics and combat, transforming mundane supply lines into decisive operational tools. By the banks of the Maas and Meuse, German units encountered the DUKWs in ways that challenged every preconception about warfare. Soldiers reported seeing fully loaded trucks appear in positions that should have been cut off, their hulls glinting under low sunlight as if the river itself carried them. Infantry that had prepared ambushes found themselves bypassed entirely, their defensive lines rendered irrelevant. From a psychological standpoint, the impact was immediate. Fear mingled with confusion as officers struggled to explain how a supposedly slow, cumbersome vehicle could consistently outmaneuver both terrain and traditional defenses. Journals from German soldiers recount a growing sense of unease as supply points previously thought isolated remained fully operational. The human battlefield experience was defined less by heroics and more by the persistent, almost uncanny presence of these amphibious trucks, arriving where they were least expected and sustaining units that should have been starving or immobilized. Tactically, the DUKW's integration into operational planning created cascading effects. Artillery batteries could maintain sustained fire without pause. Infantry units could consolidate gains without risking isolation. The ability to ferry fuel, munitions, and even engineers directly across rivers removed the delays inherent in bridge repair or construction. Allied commanders exploited this mobility with precision, coordinating crossings under cover of smoke and artillery fire to minimize exposure while maximizing logistical throughput. German forces, accustomed to predictable choke points, found themselves reacting rather than acting. Tactical reports from December 1944 note repeated instances where defensive positions, established with careful attention to river geography, were circumvented entirely. Each crossing undermined German assumptions about terrain advantage, forcing commanders to reallocate troops to guard multiple points simultaneously. An inefficient and often futile effort. The technological and logistical mastery of the DUKW cannot be understated. Its six-wheel drive allowed it to traverse rubble-strewn roads before entering water, Its propeller and rudder system enabled controlled river navigation even under current. Crews learned to read the river like a battlefield map, anticipating eddies, submerged obstacles, and hidden banks. Cargo loads were optimized for balance, ensuring that trucks did not capsize in swift currents. The vehicle's adaptability extended beyond supply. They were used for reconnaissance, casualty evacuation, and even towing light artillery. German engineers, observing from the opposite bank, recognized a fundamental flaw in their defensive calculus. No matter how thoroughly a river was fortified, a DUKW could, and often would, bypass it. Command decisions on both sides reflected the transformative impact. Allied planners embedded DUKWs at the core of offensive operations, coordinating supply and assault into a single rhythm. German leaders, facing repeated logistical surprises, increasingly treated rivers as contested zones rather than reliable barriers. Field orders began emphasizing rapid counter-deployment and the reinforcement of previously secondary positions. The trucks themselves remained unarmed, yet their operational effect mirrored that of a high-efficiency weapon. Controlling the battlefield not through direct fire, but through the ability to sustain combat power where the enemy least expected it. The morning of November 8, 1944, began with a low gray light filtering through mist along the Roer River. The Germans had prepared their defenses meticulously. Trenches dug into the banks, artillery positioned to sweep any crossing, and machine gun nests trained on every conceivable approach. Explosives had shattered the bridges, leaving jagged stumps jutting from the water, and mines littered the shallows. Yet, at 06:15, the first line of DUKWs appeared, engines humming, propellers cutting the cold water, their loads of fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies glinting in the diffuse dawn. German observers squinted through binoculars, disbelief shadowing their faces. The vehicles moved in unison, hugging the river's curves, exploiting hidden inlets and eddies, to approach the far bank undetected until the final few dozen meters. Artillery opened fire, shells plowing into the water and sending geysers skyward. Yet the trucks pressed forward, their watertight hulls absorbing near misses, their timing synchronized with smoke screens laid down by infantry and engineers. On the western bank, infantry braced for a conventional river assault, expecting soldiers to wade or pontoon bridges to creak under the weight of tanks. Instead, crates of ammunition were disgorged onto prepared landing zones within minutes. Riflemen, previously anxious about being cut off, received fresh rounds and new rations without having to expose themselves. Light artillery, loaded onto the amphibious trucks, was positioned almost instantaneously behind defensive earthworks. Casualty evacuation teams used the same DUKWs to ferry wounded soldiers back across the river under suppressive fire. The rhythmic churn of propellers, the splash of hulls striking debris, and the occasional explosion from errant German shells combined into a tense symphony of motion and destruction. Every crossing undermined the German defensive calculations. Every load delivered a strategic advantage. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Officers barked orders, but realized too late that their prepared defenses, trenches, mines, and even destroyed bridges had been rendered irrelevant. Soldiers abandoned previously manned positions, scrambling to respond to a threat that wasn't direct combat, but relentless logistical pressure. Each DUKW arrival sustained units, allowed armored reconnaissance to press forward, and provided engineers with the resources to repair positions under fire. The river, once a defensive bulwark, became a corridor of unstoppable support. German morale wavered visibly as frontline reports documented confusion, fear, and growing resentment at an enemy who seemed to have turned the landscape itself into a weapon. By mid-morning, the full scale of the operation became undeniable. Columns of DUKWs, now numbering over 50, moved in coordinated waves, their loads staggering in both variety and volume. Ammunition reached artillery positions just as German batteries prepared to adjust fire. Fuel enabled armored units to exploit gaps, and medical teams evacuated casualties with efficiency that defied the chaos of combat. Observers on the German side, initially laughing at the appearance of the floating trucks, now scrawled frantic reports of a logistical miracle that rendered river defenses moot. Attempts to shell the vehicles were partially effective, but many trucks continued their course, hulls battered yet operational, drivers expertly navigating currents and debris. On the battlefield itself, infantry and armor leveraged the uninterrupted supply to execute maneuvers that would have been impossible under conventional constraints. Tanks advanced beyond ruined roads, infantry consolidated positions previously considered tenuous, and artillery sustained a barrage that pinned German forces while engineers repaired key crossings for heavier vehicles. The tactical advantage conferred by the DUKWs manifested in real time. Positions thought secure by the Wehrmacht were bypassed, their defenders isolated, and counterattacks delayed by lack of supplies and communication. The mechanized rhythm of the river crossings created an operational tempo the Germans could neither predict nor disrupt. The logistical triumph translated into immediate strategic consequences. Commanders on the Allied side could plan with confidence, knowing that supply lines would hold even when bridges had been destroyed or roads rendered impassable. German forces, facing repeated failures to interdict these amphibious convoys, began reallocating troops to secondary riverbanks, stretching already thin resources. Field reports detail mounting frustration. Units left to guard river approaches watched as DUKWs delivered precisely what they had hoped to deny, undermining morale and eroding confidence in leadership decisions. By late afternoon, the crossing was effectively complete. Forward positions were reinforced, artillery sustained, and armor mobile. The Germans had underestimated a simple, unarmed vehicle. Its operational effectiveness reshaped the battlefield in hours. Accounts from both sides emphasize the turning moment. Not a single climactic firefight, but the relentless, precise movement of trucks carrying the essentials of war across a barrier thought insurmountable. What had begun as mockery became alarm, disbelief, and eventual acknowledgement. The river, once a natural defensive line, had been conquered without tanks, without infantry assault, but through the quiet, decisive power of engineering, coordination, and logistical mastery. In the hours following the crossings, reports from the front lines painted a stark picture of immediate consequences. German units, initially confident in their river defenses, found positions evacuated or overrun not by sheer force, but by the persistence of supply and maneuver. Casualties were recorded on both sides, yet the numbers alone failed to capture the strategic shift. Artillery positions remained operational. Infantry held ground they might have lost, and armored units maintained mobility despite destroyed bridges. Journal entries and field reports from Allied soldiers describe a mixture of relief and astonishment. Units that had expected isolation were instead reinforced and resupplied, their fighting capacity preserved. The efficiency of the DUKW convoys allowed command structures to execute orders with unprecedented reliability, ensuring that forward operations did not stall due to lack of ammunition or fuel. On the German side, the immediate psychological effects were profound. Officers struggled to reconcile meticulous defensive preparations with the persistent appearance of supplies in areas they had deemed inaccessible. Morale, already strained by sustained retreat and bombardment, declined further as logistical surprise undermined confidence in traditional strategies. Internal communications reflected disbelief. Repeated mentions of floating trucks appearing where none should be able to arrive, of rivers crossed without pontoon bridges, and of units maintained in full strength despite the destruction of infrastructure. German commanders faced a dilemma: disperse forces to guard multiple river approaches, thereby weakening defensive concentration, or risk repeated tactical defeats. The DUKW's impact was measured not in explosions or frontal assaults, but in the quiet, cumulative erosion of the enemy's operational advantage. Field notes from medics, engineers, and quartermasters underscore the human dimension of this advantage. Casualties were evacuated more efficiently. Engineers could repair and reinforce positions without exposing themselves unnecessarily. And forward units received necessary supplies exactly when required. Reports indicate that in multiple engagements along the Ruhr and Maas, units sustained by DUKW deliveries were able to repulse German counterattacks that might otherwise have forced withdrawals. The immediate aftermath was therefore a combination of preserved combat power, operational flexibility, and growing psychological pressure on opposing forces. In the weeks that followed, the long-term consequences of the DUKW's deployment became clear across the Western Front. Commanders began integrating amphibious logistics into broader operational planning, understanding that rivers no longer represented absolute barriers. The Wehrmacht, forced to adapt to a new reality, shifted defensive doctrine. Bridges were now supplemented with multiple fallback positions, and units were reassigned to monitor unexpected crossing points. Yet the scale of the challenge exceeded the German response. Allied forces continued to exploit mobility advantages, maintaining tempo in advances that would previously have stalled at natural obstacles. Reports from supply officers indicate that the efficiency of DUKW convoys allowed entire divisions to advance with fewer logistical bottlenecks, shortening operational cycles and maintaining pressure on retreating forces. Strategically, the success of the amphibious trucks influenced future military engineering and operational thought. Military planners took note of the profound effect that simple, versatile vehicles could have on the battlefield. Rivers, lakes, and flooded plains were no longer obstacles, but potential channels for maneuver and resupply. Post-war analysis by both Allied and German historians emphasized that the DUKW's contribution extended beyond raw tonnage delivered. It reshaped assumptions about terrain, logistics, and the integration of supply with combat operations. Units that might have been immobilized became self-sustaining, and the psychological effect on German troops, facing a supply line they could not interdict, reverberated through multiple engagements. The human dimension endured as well. Soldiers across ranks recounted relief and confidence in positions previously considered precarious. Engineers and drivers who operated the DUKWs became quiet heroes, their expertise ensuring continuity of operations. The lessons of this period informed both tactical doctrine and mechanized logistics planning for decades, reinforcing the principle that mobility and supply often dictate the outcome of engagements as decisively as firepower. By the end of 1944, the DUKW had earned recognition not through spectacular combat feats, but through relentless, effective, and transformative application of movement and supply, changing the face of modern warfare in a way both immediate and enduring. The story of the DUKW trucks is a lesson in the quiet power of ingenuity and logistics. Across rivers once thought impassable, they carried not guns or grenades, but the essentials that sustained life and combat alike. In doing so, they reshaped the battlefield, proving that war is won as much by movement and supply as by firepower. Soldiers, Engineers and commanders alike bore witness to this transformation. Their experiences recorded in reports, diaries, and photographs that endure as evidence of a subtle yet decisive innovation. Rivers ceased to be absolute barriers, and the psychological weight of relentless, reliable resupply shifted the balance in favor of those who mastered it. The DUKW, once laughed at as a novelty, became emblematic of a broader truth. In modern warfare, adaptability, coordination, and the ability to traverse terrain unimpeded can carry far more consequence than the might of a single weapon. Its legacy persists not only in military engineering, but in the enduring lesson that sometimes the most unassuming tools, applied with precision and understanding, change the course of history.